Hey, shalom, shalom, everybody. How y'all doing? Welcome back to Reading with SHILO. Welcome back to the next session of Reading with SHILO, so we can finish the next section of the book. We're on, which is On the Real Side. On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. A history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. And we are getting into the times I know. We're on chapter 12, the new comics, and we are reading section 2. Section 2 of chapter 12 called the new comics. One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, 7.5. 7.5 pages. Oh, it's a lot. That's what we're about to read. We're going to push through it and make it do what it do. Anyway, but when y'all come on in, man, come on in like the live. Leave me a comment so I can know that the chat is working. If you fall in, remember we're gonna look up any words that I don't know or I stumble across or I feel like need to be looked up. So prepare yourself. Prepare yourself. All right, let's get it. Oh, section 2 of chapter 12, the new comics. The new comics. Now, Timmy Rogers, Nipsey Russell, and Slappy White were among the first black comedians to do stand-up comedy on stage. Before predominantly white audiences. Now, as trailblazers, they not only absorbed many of the rejections and embarrassments visited on those who explore new territory, but also pioneered many of the adjustments black comedians were forced to make in order to amuse non-black patrons. Now, Rogers began his stage career as a child and was a vaudeville performer as a teenager during the 30s. He appeared in Blackbirds of 1936, along with stars such as Tim Moore, Peg Leg Bates, and the Nicholas Brothers. Now, in the mid-40s, he pioneered a crucial change in the stage image of African American comedians by abandoning the traditional clownish attire and donning a tuxedo for his act. He also altered his material. A singer, dancer, and songwriter, Rogers began lacing his song and dance routines with the monologue and social satire that was, as he put it, strictly political and other side of the coin when playing to white patrons. Now, at the time, however, many owners and audiences were not ready for the shift. The first time he introduced a formal attire and revamped act, the owner of the Los Angeles Clover Club fired him on the spot. Rogers was facing a problem that all of the emerging black comedians would encounter: how to adapt their humor with all of its inside racial references to present it successfully to an integrated audience. Now, despite the setback at the Clover Club, he stuck with his new approach. Rogers explained that before white audiences, I used sophisticated material that they already knew about. And in the 40s, blacks weren't into that. There was no television, so we just knew about our uptown humor, what makes a black person laugh. A white person may not understand. Now, a black comedian can say, "Shut up, fool," and black folks will laugh their butts off. Downtown, that wouldn't even get a chuckle. Now, Rogers' flexibility and persistence paid off. Smooth dancing, Clever songs, mildly upbraiding social satire, combined with his bubbling personality, reflected in the infectious catchphrase, "Oh yeah," which punctuated almost all of his jokes, had made him one of America's most successful black comics by the 50s. And in fact, he became the first comedian to headline the show at the Apollo Theater in 1957, where he introduced new variations of his "If I Were President" routine, in which familiar mother-in-law jokes were enlivened by a political setting. The president: "Now, mama, you can't talk to me like that. I'm the president of the United States." Mother-in-law: "Yeah, another one of your temporary jobs. In 4 years, you'll be back on the streets again." Now, a few years later, while most African American comics were still playing black rooms, he was working such downtown clubs as the Cafe Society. Slappy White, whom Jack Skiffman, son of former Apollo Theater owner Frank Skiffman, described as one of the most intelligent, careful comics in show business, began in a knockabout comedy act called the Two Zephyrs. Now later, teamed with Willie Lewis and then Red Fox, he moved from visual or physical comedy to dialogue humor. In the early 50s, he began working on as a single act. Now, although White continued playing the Chitlin Circuit clubs and theaters, he also appeared before predominantly white audiences as part of the Dina Washington show in Los Angeles and other clubs and theaters across the country. Little of the Two Zephyrs slapstick routines or the risque material developed during his partnership with Fox was transferable to appearances before non-black crowds. Now, White's recalled that he and Fox had bombed before a white audience at the Palace Theater in New York in the early 50s. But White, cited as the father of the integrated joke by some writers, was an inventive comedian and quickly adapted to the new circumstances. He began using typical humor that, despite having considerable bite, was acceptable to many white audiences. Now, Mayor Daley did a nice thing to elevate the dignity of a black family in Chicago. He moved them from a $100 a month apartment to one that rented for $300 so they could be closer to a welfare office. "I don't tell racial jokes to offend anyone," he would later explain. "I try to create a little humor so that all people can laugh." Ugh. Still, as with Rogers, he encountered considerable resistance. In one of the White's earliest stand-up appearances in Miami Beach during the mid-50s, a white producer instead insisted that he drop his monologue and pretend to be a porter. White complied for a few performances, playing two small audiences, then reinserted his own material and was kept on. In subsequent years, his tact and ability subtly to weave social satire into broad humor would permit him to become one of the first black comics to work the Catskills resort hotels. Later, he successfully teamed with white comedian Steve Rossi, both as a comic writer and a pioneer crossover performer. Now, White played an important role in Black American comedy's rise to mainstream recognition. Due to his frequent television appearance on talk and game shows in the 70s and 80s, Nipsey Russell is probably more recognizable to most Americans than either Rogers or White. But he also started out on the Chitlin circuit in the 40s, and between stints at the Baby Grand, continued traveling the circuit in the 50s and 60s. Like Rogers, however, Russell began shaping a more respectable and assertively intellectual comic image early in his career. He also abandoned the traditional buffoonish garb and, except for a raffish, porky hat, appeared in a conventional business clothing. A graduate of the University of Cincinnati, Russell leaned toward topical wit and sardonic social observations. Now, during one performance at the Baby Grand in the early 60s, he held up a photograph of some aspiring astronauts and said, "Not a mile among them." Later, on the subject of integration, he observed, "A seat on the top deck don't mean a thing if the ship is sinking." An articulate social satirist, Russell, more than any other black comic during the 50s, challenged his audience's verbal acuity. His use of multi-syllabic language prompted Timmy Rogers to warn him against using too many words that your audiences didn't understand. Now, bristling, challenging, defiantly confident, Russell pushed black comedians a step closer to popular acceptance by reclothing the impious vernacular wit of the streets in proper middle class language. By the 60s, audiences at his Baby Grand performances were increasingly integrated. Subsequently, Russell became a frequent guest on Jack Pear's Tonight Show, and, like Slappy White, was booked into the Concord Hotel in the Catskills. His ability spontaneously to produce funny rhyming couplets led to his being called Poet Laureate of Comedy. And he inevitably introduced catchy topical jingles when he appeared on such TV quiz shows as Hollywood Squares. Oh, yeah. His humor frequently centered on racial absurdities, as in the tale of the African delegate who stops at a Maryland restaurant and is told that they don't serve blacks. "But I am the African delegate from Ghana." The delegate proudly asserts, "Well, you ain't gonna eat here." The waitress replies. Russell's humor, however, was not confined to black issues. He prided himself on the universality of his material and insisted that he did not want to be considered a black comic. Much of his humor focused on broader topics and offered general observations, as in his famous quip, "America is the only place in the world where you can work in an Arab home, in a Scandinavian neighborhood, and find a Puerto Rican baby eating matzo balls with chopsticks." Although, through his frequent television appearances, Russell attained more prominence than Rogers or White, none of these excellent comedians received the national exposure that they might have. Now, in the 50s, mainstream America's tolerance for black comics was, at best, spotty. Now, by the 60s, Dick Gregory would temporarily eclipse all common competitors as he was catapulted to the top of the heap. George Kirby, more a song and dance man, a master impressionist than a stand-up monologuist, was the only African-American comic entertainer to achieve national recognition in the 50s. Now, after being discovered at the nightclub Delisa in 1947, he became a regular guest on television variety and talk shows and played some of the best rooms in the country, breaking down long-standing racial barriers. His career was halted when he spent 2 years in the United States Public Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, for treatment of his drug addiction. Now, released in 1960, he began a comeback but never achieved the stardom promised by his 50s accomplishments. Now, Rogers, White, and Russell, despite his reluctance to be pigeonholed as a black comic, and Kirby made the first significant moves towards bringing a new image of African American comedy to a national audience. The temper of the times, however, assured that before the comics reached mainstream audiences, much of the edge in their humor was blunted. While all four comics intentionally abandoned the dialect, jokes, buffoonish costumes, and obsequious postures associated with the old-time comedians, white owners and media executives made sure that they also toned down the explicit language, sexual references, and bluntly assertive racial and social satire that had begun to emerge on the Chitlin circuit. Initially, in front of white audiences, there were clear restraints on the role of the freewheeling gesture commenting with impunity on whatever struck his fancy. Now, pianist Junior Mance recalled, for instance, that Slappy White frequently addressed his jibes to audience members. During a Las Vegas engagement with the Dinah Washington show in the mid-50s, when the cigar-chomping manager of the room they were working began nervously pacing the floor each time White started his act. White targeted him. After a few performances, the manager, irritated by the mild jokes at his expense, approached White and told him he was through. White had overstepped the tacit agreement that black comedians avoid wisecracks and insolent quips to white customers, let alone managers of the club. They were, of course, limits on every comedian's material, but for black comics in the 50s, the restraints often had a distinctly racial cast. Now, White stayed with the show in this instance, but only because Dana Washington insisted that if he left, the rest of the act would also leave. Go ahead, Dana, or Dinah. Nearly all of the African American stand-up comedians who began working in white or integrated clubs in the 50s had similar experiences. They were forced to walk a tightrope. They represented the front line in the mainstream emergence of genuine African American humor, and they were aware of the discretion required. Now, Moms Mabley and Red Fox, by adhering to the blunter and more irreverent humor of the black masses, assured that they would be bypassed initially. But the discreet entry of Rogers, White, Kirby, and Russell into the world of mainstream stand-up comedy had begun breaking down the barriers. By the end of the decade, comedians were no longer arbitrarily eliminated from consideration for bookings before white audiences. By the 60s, as these pioneers advanced their careers, a group of younger, less inhibited, and even more assertive African American comedians were preparing their acts. All aboard, let's get it, baby. Formidable obstacles remain. For some of those who honed their skills on the Chitlin circuit, aiming their humor at exclusively black audiences, a full-scale revamping of their style and material was required. As Timmy Rogers points out, white audiences could not be expected to understand undiluted African American humor. It was not necessarily, as Rogers claimed, that the material had to become more sophisticated. However, instead, it had to be stripped of jargon and intercommunity reference that were meaningless or puzzling to outsiders. Actually, much black humor had to be simplified or decoded for non-black audiences. So in other words, it had to be dumbed down. We had to dumb our shit down for them. The maze of double or reverse meanings, code words, and gestures, stealth and intentional obfuscations that since slavery had shaped and informed the discourse and humor of most African Americans had to be translated into literal terms and symbols that were recognizable to outsiders. Now, inevitably, something was lost in that translation, since in many instances, the ambivalent manner in which a humorous remark was coached was itself the essence of the humor. Now, Mom's Mabley's familiar opening, "Hi, children, how y'all doing tonight? Yeah, I know. I knows how y'all feel. Mom's is tired too," for example, was not just a folksy greeting. It drew applause and laughter from black audiences because of the shared recognition of its underlying irony and indirect criticism of American racial bigotry. To white audiences in the 40s and 50s, however, it was probably unfathomable. Now, by the 70s, Richard Pryor could elicit laughter at least squirmish acknowledgement from mixed crowds by expressing the sentiment candidly. How long? How long will this bullshit go on? Beyond the problems of mechanics, vernacular speech, circuitous delivery, and cryptic reference, the even larger impediment looms: the interpersonal dynamic between the comedian and the audience. As Sigmund Freud pointed out, although comic process needs only two elements, the comedian and the person or thing that is the object of the humor, external affirmation of the success of that process or joke work lies with the third party, the listener or the audience. Now, according to Freud, some degree of benevolence or kind of neutrality on an absence of any factor that could provoke feelings opposed to the purpose of the joke is an indispensable condition. An indispensable condition of the third person is to collaborate on the completion of the process of the making a joke. Somehow, then African American comedians had to diffuse the racial hostility and entrenched us versus them syndrome that characterized traditional black-white relationships in America. As Lily Tomlin noted about stage comedy in general, the best material makes a comment without ridiculing and includes everyone in the comment. The audiences had to be included in the joking process to the extent that the shared viewpoint regarding the objects of the joke was established. An integrated joke is finally one in which, momentarily at least, black comics and white audiences function in an equitably we relationship. One that not only shatters the image of the naive Negro stage comic, but also includes non-blacks in the humor. Instead of, as in much black circuit comic, excluding whites by either focusing on inside humor or making them the object of the joke. Now, in the 50s and 60s, this was no small order for black comics, I bet. One of the first to overcome these obstacles and rise to national prominence was Dick Gregory, who was a wiry, quick-witted, 28-year-old upstart that catapulted to fame shortly after appearing on Chicago's Playboy Club in January of 1961. Gregory had been raised by his mother in a St. Louis slum With the aid of an athletic scholarship, he attended Southern Illinois University before deciding to pursue a career on the stage. In the late 50s, he worked small black clubs like Chicago Esquire Lounge as the MC and comedian for $10 a night. And by 1960, he worked up to the more imposing Robert's Show Club. But Gregory was an ambitious and methodical comedian. Even while he played black clubs in the Chicago area, he began fashioning a strategy for the future when he would perform where the bread was, in the big white clubs. Gregory had watched Nipsey Russell slay the mostly white audiences, most of whom were making their first trip to the south side of Chicago, who turned out for his appearance with Sammy Davis Jr. at Robert's Show Club in 1960. But he had almost watched Russell present the same routine downtown in a white club as part of an audition for the American Guild of Variety Artists, where he died. Gregory concluded that the white listeners were so nervous in the black environment that anything the comic says to relieve his tension will absolutely knock him out. When comfortable and secure on their own turf, however, white audiences felt no compunction to laugh at racial material that they didn't want to hear. The solution for Gregory was thoughtfully calculated. I've got to go up there as an individual first, a Negro second. I've got to be a colored funny man, not a funny colored man. I've got to act like a star who isn't sorry for himself. That way, they can't feel sorry for me. I've got to make jokes about myself before I can make jokes about them and their society. Using this general framework, Gregory conceived a rapid-paced act. Hit them fast before they can think. Just my luck. Bought a suit with 2 pair of pants today. Burnt the hole in the jacket. Just my luck. Bought a suit with 2 pairs of pants today. Burnt a hole in my jacket. In the jacket. Then a joke about the civil rights movement and the request to buy a lifetime membership to the NAACP. Told him I'd pay a week at a time. Hell of a thing to buy a lifetime membership. Wake up one morning and find the country's been integrated. A pause, then more misdirection. Wouldn't it be a hell of a thing if all this was burnt cork and you people were being tolerated for nothing? Now, you've got them. No bitterness, no taunting. Now you can settle down and talk about anything you want. Gregory carefully examined the curious relationship between a black jokester whose material, in part, targets white racism and white audiences whom the comic is supposed to amuse. He realized that the psychological baggage, anxiety, guilt, subliminal anger, and hate was boundless and potentially disastrous. Now, hecklers, for example, were a problem for stand-up comics in the best circumstances, but they loomed as a much greater threat in integrated settings. They had to be quieted, and of course, they were more standard rejoinders for black audiences. I wouldn't come on your job and knock the mop out of your hand, Flip Wilson might say at the Apollo. More bitingly, one might use Timmy Rogers' "Shut up, fool," or Richard Pryor's ultimate equalizer, "What about your mama?" But while these, or The more devastating retorts employed by Red Fox worked with black audiences. At the time, they were impractical for white crowds. There was too great of a chance of turning the room against you, severing the tentative bond that a comic must establish with an audience. Now, for Gregory, the answer was again diversion. Deflect the hostility and potential insult with a joke of it. He even prepared for the maximum affront. The drunk who calls you a nigger. You hear what that guy called me? Roy Rogers' horse? He called me Trigger. Or he would explain that his contact stipulated that he got $50 every time someone shouted the word and required that everybody in the room please stand up and yell, nigger. When he was unexpectedly called to replace Professor Irwin Corey at the Playboy Club in January of 1961, Gregory had already tested his approach in small, working-class white clubs. He was prepared, and although the manager suggested he postpone his appearance because the club was hosting a convention for a group of Southern businessmen, Gregory insisted that it was not a problem. He later admitted, the audience fought me with dirty little insulting statements, but by the end of the evening, he had a room filled with converts. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I understand there are a good many Southerners in the room tonight. I know the South very well. I spent 20 years there one night. It's dangerous for me to go back, you see. You see, when I drink, I think I'm Polish. One night, I got so drunk, I moved out of my own neighborhood. Last time I was down south, I walked into this restaurant and this white waitress came up to me and said, "We don't serve colored people here." I said, "That's all right. I don't eat colored people. Bring me the whole fried chicken." About that time, these three cousins come in. You know, the ones, the Ku Klux and Klan. And they say, "Boy, we're giving you fair warning Anything you do to that chicken, we gonna do to you." So about then the waitress brought me my chicken. Remember, boy, anything you do to that chicken, we gonna do to you. So I put down my knife and fork and picked up that chicken and I kissed it. Kiss the chicken butt. Kiss that chicken butt. Gregory's Playboy Club date was a sensation. His contract was quickly extended from a few weeks to 3 years. Within a year of his debut, he was a national celebrity. And after Time magazine reporters saw his act and wrote an article, appearances on the Jack Paar and David Susskind television show followed. Then a recording contract and bookings in the best rooms. By December of 1962, a Newsweek story would report, from the moment he was booked at the Playboy Club, Jim Crow was dead in the joke world. Success at one crucial booking had snatched him from relative obscurity and thrusted him into the limelight. Get out there, Dick Gregory. Almost. Now, Gregory had vaulted ahead of a large field of more experienced African-American comedians and became the first black comic superstars since Burt Williams and Stephen Fetching, and simultaneously, he had opened the floodgates for a raft of previously ignored black comedians. Although older black comedians benefited from Gregory's overnight acceptance, they were also startled and perplexed. His material, after all, was not radically innovative. As mentioned in chapter 11, some of the jokes he told were common currency in black communities. In a more pointed street version of the joke about the racist who tell a black man, anything you do to that chicken, we're going to do to you. The black man kisses the chicken's ass. and like most comedians, he had picked up lines from other funny men and reworked them to fit his routine. In fact, Timmy Rogers, Slappy White, and Nipsey Russell, who had ventured into non-black clubs while he was still in college, felt that he had pirated some of their best lines. According to Nat Hentoff, when Gregory opened at the Blue Angel in New York in 1961, he sat at the front row table with a tape recorder. The Angry Trio did tape Gregory's act, watching him with undisguised disdain all the while. We wanted to find out. Slappy White wrote Gregory's few. My bad. We wanted to find out. Slappy White wrote Gregory a few days later, which of our material not to use anymore. Now, parts of Gregory's material may have been familiar to black audiences, but few white Americans had heard anyone talk so candidly about race. His appraisal of the psychological dynamics of black-white interactions had served him well. The careful, moderately assertive approach he adopted in retrospect was perfectly suited for mainstream audiences who, either out of guilt or sincere concern, were prepared to be chided about racism, even though they might have balked at scornful lampooning or outright ridicule. Now, Gregory had devised a stand-up persona that cast him as a patient, self-assured ironist, capable of dispensing witticism about racial relationships with cool detachment. His monologues mirrored the biting satiric perceptions of the most alienated segment of Black America, but because they were delivered deftly and without rancor, were not perceived as oblique, O-B-L-O-Q-U-I, O-B-L-O-Q-U-I, O-B-L-O-Q-U-I. Oblique. Go get the blicky. The old blicky. ABL. ABLO. Not here. ABLOQ. ABLOQ. ABLOQUI. I mean, oh, not A. My bad. O. OBL. Oh, that sleep monster trying to get me when I'm at the end. OBLO. Oh, obloquy. 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 Deviating from a square I mean, my bad. That's oblong. Oblique. Oblique. Oh, oblique. Oh man. To speak against. A strongly condemnatory utterance. Abusive language. The condition of one that is discredited. The oblique. 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 The oblique. Sophisticated, aloof, and seemingly observing from the viewpoint of amused neutrality, he was able to introduce into the integrated settings. Ooh. A racial satire that, while more aggressive than that of his predecessors, was clearly more palatable to white Americans. In part, his method, much like that of Rogers, White, and especially Nipsey Russell, involved discarding the clownish appearance, dialect speech, and inside Negro jokes that might characterize him as a black comedian, and distance him from mainstream audiences. I only got a couple of pages left. Oh Lord. Oh, man, hold up. Whew. Get off me, monster. The sleep monster. Sleep monster on me. You trying to get me? All right. Oh, man. Gonna push through, baby. Man, he just jumped on me. He's shaking me. Sleep, nigga. You want to read? You gonna go to sleep. Sleepy. I don't finna. Sleepy. Come on, SHILO. Read that book. 3 more pages, man. 2.5. 2.5. Ooh wee. Ooh wee. You know, I'm telling my eyes, man. It's on me. My bad. I'm just taking a breather, man. Mistake. Oh man, mistake. Stand up. Let's shake it off, man. Shake the sleep monster off here. Shake him off here. Ah! Man, come on, sleep monster. Get off. Get off me. All right. Let's get back. My bad, man. I had to stand up. Oh, good Lord. Good googly moogly. That's my boy. What's up? Oh, yes, sir. You get a hug anytime, man. For the most part, anytime. Except for I'm on the toilet. If I'm on the toilet, you gotta wait for I'm done. Let you get a hug after I'm done. All righty. I needed that hug too. All right, let's go. 2.5 pages left. 2.5 pages left. Ah, man. He also avoided the candid sexual material on which Red Fox and Moms Maidley traded. If you use blue material, he wrote in nigger, you slip back into being that Negro stereotype comic. It was not until later in his career that he introduced mildly suggestive jokes, such as one about the white subordinate who sees a Negro cutting the lawn of the previously vacant house next door and asks, "What do you get for doing yard work?" The Negro answers, what do you get for doing yard work? The Negro answers, "I'll get to sleep with the lady of the house. You need any help?" In effect, Gregory avoided most of the superficial mannerisms and traditional subjects that overtly defined old-time African American humor, concentrating on the irony and satire that undergirded it. While partly a concession to mainstream entertainment style, this modification allowed him to focus more intently on the humorous depiction of racial inequities that were not only his central concern, but also had been a significant subject of Black American comedy since slavery. Now, still, that adaptability does not entirely explain how Gregory outstripped more experienced comedians and quickly assumed the mantle of America's leading Black comedian in the 60s. Perhaps, of course, he was simply a far more talented comedian than his rivals. But despite his sharp wit, some critics question his ability as a pure comic. Now, Gregory is more a mechanic. Say it again. He backed up by Yachty. Don't worry about him. That's Yachty homeboy. But he better get out of my yard. You holler at him. Tell him, get out of my yard, sucker. Made me lose my place, man. While partly a concession to mainstream entertainment style, this modification allowed him to focus more intently on the humorous depiction of racial inequities that were not only his central concern, but also had been a significant subject of Black American comedy since slavery. Now, still, that adaptability does not entirely explain how Gregory outstripped more experienced comedians and quickly assumed the mantle of America's leading Black comedian. In the 60s, perhaps, of course, he was simply a far more talented comedian than his rivals, but despite his wit, some critics question his ability as a pure comic. Gregory is more a mechanic than a spontaneously creative comedian. Nat, Nat Hentoff wrote, he would probably be disseminated in an ad lib duel with Red Fox, Mom Maidley, or Nipsey Russell. Ironically, the timing of Gregory's emergence suggests that his inexperience in working the Black comedy circuit may have hastened his ascendance. The 60s were volatile times in which social and interpersonal racial relations were rapidly shifting. Television viewers were being besieged by violent images of racial confrontations in the South, and the contradictions between segregation and democracy were forcing many Americans to re-examine their moral stance and question their personal convictions about race and equality more candidly than at any other time in American history. Since African American entertainers were among the most visible representatives of the black community. For many Americans, they assumed a disproportionately significant role in this process. However, stand up comedy was changing the way that comedians related to their audiences. Without the protection of the former formal mask of narrative drama, without a song, a dance, or any other intermediary composition that creates distance between performer and performance, the stand-up comedian addresses an audience as a naked shelf. The media critic David Mark notes, the exposure of the stand-up comic to public judgment is extraordinarily raw and personal. For black comedians working white rooms, the increased importance placed on a comic's personal acceptance was diametrically opposed to the traditional roles assumed by the black entertainers and white audiences in America. Public acknowledgement or sanction of personal relationship between blacks and whites had been fiercely resisted for over 200 years. From the early 20th century, black minstrels who wore their ragged stage costumes even went off stage to avoid harassment by whites through the disturbance caused by release of Darktown Jubilee in 1914, in which Bert Williams' appearance without blackface and top hat entails on to the riots caused by non-black females over enthusiastic displays of affection for such performers as Nat King Cole and Cab Calloway, for instance. The instance on depersonalized relations between black performers and white audiences had been zealously enforced. Specifically, with regard to comedy, white audiences had traditionally laughed at black comics not with them. Almost there, baby. We're almost there. Dick Gregory emerged at a time not only when the distance between comedians and audiences was being erased, but also when the established public barriers between whites and blacks were being challenged at lunch counters and flaunted through integrated freedom rides. Many mainstream Americans, shaken by blacks' intensifying push for equal rights, were primed for the satirical African American voice that mirrored the moral and ethical candor displayed by such civil rights leaders as Martin Luther King. Some, able to emphasize with blacks' frustration and impatience, were even receptive to the assertiveness of Malcolm X. Now, few, even among the most virulent racists, could still be amused and comforted by the servile postures and diffident tricksterism of the old-time Negro stage comedians when evening news shows broadcast pictures of thousands of blacks, formerly perceived as Uncle Toms and Sambos, braving fire hoses, police dogs, rabid mobs, and brutal sheriffs in the struggle for equal rights. The sham was over, both in the streets and on stage, and Gregory, more a candid satirist than entertaining funny man, appeared at exactly the right time. Although such comedians as Rogers, Wrights, Kirby, and Russell pioneered the transition from classic backstage humor with its traditional costumes, dialect, and indirect satire to a more forthright and dignified comic presentation on mainstream stages, they had worked the black circuits for years. Despite having abandoned the prominent stereotypes associated with that humor, most retained some subtle residual mannerisms and passively slumped shoulder while delivering a punchline, an overly exaggerated widening of the eyes, or an apprehensive glance in the search of approval from non-black audiences. Gregory had been, oh, you back up. I know, look at you, my bro. Oh, you back awake. Oh, he was up before you, man. You feeling all right, man? You sure? You sound like something wrong. Talk. Let me hear you say something. What you gonna say, my man? Go ahead. Go ahead. Hey, get them. Make sure you use the plastic bowls, not the glasses. All right. Yes, sir. Gregory had been interested in topical humor from the start of his career. Although he played black clubs where the patrons insisted on black blue humor, he had resisted, weaving topical jokes into more risque material and often annoying owners and customers. Now, for a brief period in 1959, he even opened his own club, the Apex in Robbins, Illinois, in which he could concentrate on the social satire that he preferred. Unlike his precursors, he had not been thoroughly groomed in black circuit stage humor, which requires, among other things, that one be a funny man or jester in the traditional sense, less hampered by the baggage of traditional Negro stage images. He more easily assumed the cocker, more self-confident approach of the social satire. In a sense, Gregory was to most of his black forerunners what Mort Sahl was to Milton Berle and other non-black vaudeville comics. Gre- Say it again? No, sir. Get the green plastic bowl. Yes, sir. I showed DJ which bowl. DJ knows which bowl. Tell DJ get you a bowl and get him a bowl. Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm. Gregory, as Saul had earlier, realized that the social climate that shifted had shifted enough to make his brand of satire palatable to a larger audience. In addition, he had also squarely faced the problem of whites' stereotyped view of black performers. As he points out in his autobiography, black comics encountered white audiences who either hated them or felt sorry for them because they were Negroes. The former were usually unreachable and the latter, in terms of laughter, were unreliable. They can't respect someone they pity, and eventually they'll stop laughing. Gregory observed, African American comedians had to dispel the pity with self-assurance. They had to project a cocksure dominant image that erased lingering suspicions of inferiority and clearly engaged their audience on an equal basis. It was not necessary that they told racial jokes or focus on social satire, but it was essential that they dislodge all traces of the minstrel image of the servile, slow-witted Sambo, who had hounded them like a shadow for over a century. Clearly, clever, witty, deeply committed to social revolution in the streets, deeply committed, my bad, to social revolution in the streets, and particularly untutored in the evasive, indirect humor of the black stage, Gregory was perfectly equipped for the challenge. Initially, he moderated his commentary. Shortly after his appearance before the largely Southern audience at the Playboy Club, for instance, a critic wrote, "He is cautious and deft. and never deeply cutting or openly aggressive. Once he had gained a foothold, however, Gregory's social satire assumed more acerbic overtones. From the outset, his cleverness and sense of irony were apparent. I sat at a lunch counter for 9 months. They finally integrated and didn't have what I wanted. Indirection and sarcasm were soon replaced with jibes aimed at more specific targets. On America and racism, he quipped. I'm really for Abraham Lincoln. If it hadn't been for Abe, I'd still be on the open market. You know the definition of a Southern moderate. That's a cat that'll lynch you from a low tree. Or, what a country! Where else could I have to ride in the back of the bus, live in the worst neighborhoods, go to the worst schools, eat at the worst restaurants, and average $5,000 a week just talking about it? White America's arrogance was pilloried. Man, look, no, they don't have any more styrofoam bowls. They have plastic bowls, son. The plastic bowls is green. They have two glass bowls. They have the white glass bowl. They have the black glass bowl. They're on top. Move them out the way and get you a plastic bowl that's right underneath. Understood? Manoa, did you understand what I said? Okay, thank you. You got to say this for whites. Excuse me, my bad. Hey, man. Manoa! Come here. Hey, look, if you can't find the bowls, just wait. Just wait. I have one more page. After I'm done reading, I'll come fix it. All right? Just wait. Hey, matter of fact, just tell DJ, y'all just wait so y'all don't break anything. Okay? All right, roger that. You got to say this for whites. Their self-confidence knows no bounds. Who else could go to a small island in the South Pacific where there's no crime, poverty, unemployment, war, or worry and call it a primitive society? The political process of African Americans' disdain for its inherent hypocrisy was targeted as well. The president is willing to give Lockheed $250 million. When it comes to giving welfare layouts to black folks, so many legislators say they ought to learn to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. So I sent the president of Lockheed Aircraft a telegram. Why don't you learn to pull yourself up by your own landing gear? I just can't understand Lockheed asking for all that welfare money, and they don't even have illegitimate planes. And they don't have any illegitimate planes. Reagan is nigger spelled shit. Reagan is nigger spelled backwards. Imagine we get backwards niggas running California. Fully aware of his link with comedy's new straight-talking social satirists, at the end of his act, Gregory would often quip, "If I've done anything to upset you, maybe it's what I'm here for." Lenny Bruce shakes up the Puritans, Mort Sahl, the conservatives, and me, almost everybody. By the mid-60s, as he became more involved in the civil rights movement, Gregory's humor became more caustic and bitter. He also became more of a political and human rights advocate than a humorist. His commitment to political activism forced him to cancel concerts and club dates, and gradually, comedy became a secondary enterprise. In 1967, he said that he viewed himself as a social commentator who used humor to interpret the needs and wants of Negroes to the white community, rather than as a comedian who happens to deal in topical social material. And by that time, however, his lasting impact was readily apparent. As Red Fox asserted in 1967, a new brand of Negro comic has surfaced. He's clever, poised, informed, and tells it like it is. And Gregory's influence on this newly emerging type was enormous. He established a new voice, a new sound for black comics and satirists, which was Tony Hendricks' notes. Not aggressive so much as non-ingratiating, less challenging than unapologetic, and therefore more real and more confident. Gregory's more real humor was not, of course, new to Black Americans, but it was a revelation to its new white audiences. By introducing it to the public, he opened the mainstream stage for many older Black comedians, as well as a new group of younger ones who waited anxiously in the wings. And that's that for section 2. That's that for section 2 of chapter 12, the new comics of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins, man. Dick Gregory was coming up doing his thing. Let's see that. Man. Section 3, section 4. Okay, we have 4 sections in this chapter. Next time we'll come back next time and read section 3, and after that section 4, and we're gonna jump to 13, and then afterwards we'll be out of here, man. We'll be out of here on this book, and it'll be another mark I can mark on another bone for the bone yard, the book yard, bones of the books. I'll be on 21 for sure. But that's that, man. Thank you for everybody who stopped by, watch me read, watch that sleep monster get on me towards the end. Choking me. He had me in the choke. So I should have did. Needed. But it's all gravy. We made it. Oh, excuse me. We made it. We made it to the end. We made it to the end. Oh, to the end of the section today. All praises. All praises. We're going to keep pushing, man. We're going to keep pushing. Until next time, man. Shallow out, man. I hope you enjoyed. Leave a comment. Like, comment, subscribe. All that good jazz there. Tell me what you think about the reading. Tell me, have you learned something? Fill me in. Say something. Let's get this thing going and moving. But until next time, man. Shallow out. Holla at y'all.